Great. So, hi everybody. My name's Julian from Awakening from the Meaning Crisis Discord server. I live in Australia, and today we're having a Dialogos with Capello, who is also a member of the Discord server. Hey, Capello.
Howdy. Thanks for having me.
A pleasure. A real pleasure. So, the Dialogos today is mainly going to be centering around the idea of exploring the similarities and differences between shamanism and Christianity. So I'm a Christian, that's my background, that's my religion. My understanding is that Capello is a man of great learning, especially with regards to not just shamanism, but many, I suppose, esoteric and historical spiritual practices. I should just say that what sparked this for me was that as part of the server, I really took notice of you, Capello, because of how you were conducting yourself with, some members who are just difficult to interact with, bordering on nuisance, that kind of thing. And I was really paying attention to other people and whether or not they, and myself included, whether or not we could respond in a wise and a virtuous way. Not an ineffectual way, but in a wise and virtuous way. And I really noticed how you handled yourself that way. And it really stood out for me that you were wise about doing that in particular. So,
well, thank you.
Yeah. Is there anything you want to bounce back?
Just real quick, that I would say that the Discord itself, as far as places on the internet go, I would say very patient. I was not the only one with sort of patience and empathy there. So, there's lots of places to argue on the internet, but the John Vervaeke Discord, while it has some share of that, there's people there genuinely seeking something more from internet discourse. And I think that really came out in our interactions. It comes out in our good interactions, but I think you can also see it in some of our more problematic ones too.
Yeah, I agree. I like the positive note you're putting on that. And the truth is, obviously, that wisdom, as much as we desire it, it only shows itself in those kinds of situations through people. So as people can see, you're not on video. You're a bit of a mystery to me, at least, but an attractive mystery, which is a good one. Wondering, I suppose, before we go into the question of shamanism, especially, would you be able to outline a little bit, Capello, some of your interests? I think that might be a good way to get some sort of a profile with you. What I've noticed, as I said, is you seem to have a deep knowledge of kind of indigenous spirituality, especially, but also historical and so on. Did you want to maybe give some sort of an outline or a story?
I can try, yeah. So I think, and I want to try to bridge this a little bit with something people might see in themselves and other experiences that I think are fairly common, not just to the John Vervaeke sort of community, but I would say are common themes that you might see in the Jordan Peterson sort of milieu. There's a lot of people who are finding different ways of partially addressing the meaning crisis in a way, even if they don't call it by that name, trying to almost get back to roots or get back to some sort of grounding for the things that are missing in what we are given in sort of everyday, the meaning given to us in everyday sort of social interactions and work and popular culture. And I think a lot of people have different ways of doing that. I don't know if you're familiar with him, but Jonathan Pajot, and there's a whole, Paul Vanderklee, there's a great community of Christian thinkers, I think, who are looking back to Christianity, sometimes in its deepest, most orthodox roots, for inspiration and grounding. And I think there's also a renewal in interest in shamanism as well, that I think is coming to the fore, partially for similar reasons. I think the other reason it's becoming a little more visible now is to do with the so-called psychedelic renaissance, right? So it's almost unavoidable to sort of have a connection between psychedelic experiences and shamanism. They're very closely linked, at least in the popular imagination. How closely they're linked in actual history and anthropology is probably more complicated. But in any case, there's a bit of a popular renewal in the topic, I think, because of that. But I think also people are looking for a sense of grounding for where they are in society, who they are as people. How do we find meaning in the human condition? You know, very basic questions. And I'm no exception. And my way of looking at it started in looking into human history and prehistory. I have a very strong interest in Paleolithic archaeology, the history of ancient civilizations, human evolution, genetic anthropology to an extent, really trying to work my way back to understand what, you know, in the time that we've been here as a species, what are we? What does it mean to be human? You know, very sort of basic questions that are hard to answer without trying to synthesize a large amount of information at once. And my approach to this was, for many years, very academic, based on just, you know, learning history, prehistory, lots of dry archaeological papers. But you miss something of the gestalt in that type of research. You miss, you can't feel it, right? And I knew this, and I knew there was something missing. And I thought, well, you know, there was a worldview attached to all of these technologies. There was a worldview, a way of living, a way of looking at the world that was attached to all these things that I'm researching about. And I don't know what it is. I have no idea how to articulate it. I have no idea what it would look like, much less feel like. And I thought, well, you know, let's take a closer look. And that's how I started looking at shamanism. And then about a year ago, I was listening to an interview on the local public radio of Tanya Luhrmann, who's an American anthropologist famous for her studies on evangelical Christian prayer and the experience of communicating directly with God in Christian communities. And very, very interesting researcher, comes at it with a very sort of lived, non-reductionistic point of view. As a, you know, doesn't really seek to reduce or make judgments about what is quote unquote really real in these people's experience. She wants to tell the story from their perspective, what they're experiencing, what it means to them, how it changes their lives. And I was in the car and my mind wanders as people's do, driving around. And I thought, well, what if someone took this kind of direct approach using shamanistic techniques in their approach to studying and trying to really feel kind of human prehistory in a way? And I gave it a shot, and things happened. So it's been an interesting journey ever since. I would not call it shamanism. I would say I am a amateur, I don't know, enthusiast in matters of spirituality and human prehistory, who uses shamanistic techniques, I suppose, to try to get at a more participatory and perspectival approach, to use John's language, at what am I missing here? What can the words not convey? And it's been an eye-opening journey for sure.
Yes, well, as expected, you're unearthing a treasure trove of possibilities in what you're talking about, Capello. So I suppose let me respond in a kind of a generalized way and then go a little deeper. So my background with Christianity is, following on from a personal crisis. I decided I'd go looking for, when I was around about 15 to 19 years old, having to do with family problems. And I felt that sense of what you did, something missing. For me, I think it was a lot more painful and powerful than that label. Perhaps it was for you too, but for me, there was this sense of something black and cavernous within my experience that was always there but remained unaddressed. And I was, through that crisis, seeing the need to plumb the depths of things that I had on my periphery. So, I grew up in a churched family, you could say. There was sort of an Anglican stream there. I sang in a high Anglican choir for 8 years, and that was very influential. My mum stopped into a Catholic church for a while, and, the extended family had a strong Christian influence as well. Anglican boys' school, all of those things. But the meaning of Christianity for me was, it was always there, but it wasn't connected to, if you know what I mean. And so I was open to anything really at the age of 19 or thereabouts to say, I'll give anything a shot. I remember inviting some Mormons in to the house and I said, look, I'll do you a deal. If you listen to me play my rock guitar song, I'll listen to your version of the gospel. What do you think?
It's a fair deal, right?
Yeah. Well, I still remember the guy, Elder Spencer. He was a great guy from Utah, obviously, and very, very congenial and friendly guy, and put up with a bit from me. But, I was looking to make a connection to something real. I went to, in Melbourne, where I'm from, originally, I remember going to the town hall to like a lady who was a Hindu and giving a talk and thinking, okay, I'll give it a shot, and just didn't connect at all with any of it. So long story short, I came to a crucial moment. I was working in a kind of a deli job in a kind of an upmarket place in the city and getting treated badly by people and feeling badly in myself as well. I was doing, some light drugs to try and be a bad boy at the time, and drinking to excess and other kinds of things, because my frame of theology was that be a good boy, good things will happen. And this was clearly shattered by some personal events. Where I'm going with all this is that ultimately I went back to an evangelical church and found a mentor who I thought embodied the kind of spirituality that was the antithesis of the ossified, stagnant, and irrelevant forms of church that I'd seen. I mean, this guy was full of life. He'd swear and give a real opinion about things. He wasn't closeted, if you know what I mean. And he was a bit radical, and I thought, this is great. I think before he became a Christian, he was he came from a wealthy family, but he decided to be a communist and go to church and stand up on a soapbox and preach, about the evils of capitalism, et cetera, et cetera. He was an interesting guy. I still respect him, though we had our differences. Anyway, the point I'm trying to make, Capello, is that I entered into a faith commitment to bridge the gap between where I was to what it was I wanted to be, what it was I felt was missing. It's a very long story, and it involves therapy 10 years later, and not to do with the religion per se. So that's where I'm coming from with my relating to you in terms of talking about maybe you were coming maybe more academically, but you also wanted to bridge the gap into something more, perhaps we could say three-dimensional, something you can touch, something you can move in.
Lived, I would say.
Right, right. So I just wanted to give that backstory from my end, but also I think for people who are listening, shamanism, as you said, is kind of an in thing more and more, and that's not necessarily bad. So I had to learn a bit about it. And it's a catch-all name, as far as I can tell. It covers just a plethora of practices which are historic and tribal and spiritual, etc., but aren't, the word shaman, as I understand it, is Siberian, from Siberian dialect, and a lot of the reference to shamanism comes from maybe anthropologists in Stalinist Russia who was studying the Siberians there. Is that correct?
I would say older than that. 19th century is where it really started coming into the popular imagination in Europe. And it would go through phases, just like it's coming back now in a way. It seems to go in cycles of popularity, and it takes on new forms and colorations, mostly from the point of view of people who are using it to sort of almost project what they want onto it in some ways, more than, anything to do with the actual cultures it comes from.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So is it fair to say, that word shaman is kind of a tag more than something you can directly apply to this or that group? Is that fair?
I think it depends on what community you're talking to. But yeah, I mean, broadly speaking, you will see people use that term to refer to, I've seen people use it to refer to almost anyone who infers any kind of spiritual aspect to the use of even casual use of psychedelic drugs, which I don't think is the appropriate use of the term, but you will definitely find it there. And then there's other people on the other side of the spectrum who say that it shouldn't be used to apply to anything except that particular Siberian religion. Um, in a very narrow view, that the term was essentially stolen, and that you can't generalize between these different religious spiritual practices, and really that word should only refer to their spirituality, which I think has some validity. But I think there's also a big middle ground where there's been a lot of research, cross-cultural studies, as well as studies in evolutionary psychology and anthropology that really show that there is something universal here, probably due to its age. We're talking about a set of shared spiritual practices that are roughly maybe 65,000 years old, that they can actually trace. Actually, we're sort of in an interesting case. We both live in continents that have, surviving shamanic traditions that probably last shared a common ancestor in Africa 65,000 years ago. We're sort of live on the peripheries of this wave of human migration that happened ages and ages ago. But there's definitely a shared heritage there. And that's sort of where I think the scholarly consensus is. And that's where I try to align my own definitions. Although when you're dealing with Western communities, particularly those that are experimenting with these things outside of an established tradition, it's hard to know what to call it. I would say shamanistic is probably the safest thing. It's inspired or maybe borrowed from various indigenous practices, but you can't. The perspective of the indigenous practice is probably so different from even a fairly experienced and learned outsider that they really do, in my opinion, deserve different terms. So I like to play it safe and do shamanistic, because I think that captures a little bit more of the borrowing that I think is really going on.
That sounds fair. Yeah. I'd like to try and sort of revolve this into a participatory mindset. what you said triggered something in me, Capello, which was, are you familiar with the integral theory stuff?
No, I'm not.
Okay. So, caveat, I don't think John Vervaeke is pro the integral theory model. I found it helpful personally. So let me give a small frame and see if that fits in. Essentially, it's about how consciousness evolves. So, if we're all evolutionary creatures, this model tries to say, well, what does the model of our consciousness evolving look like? And the theory is that as you evolve, your consciousness becomes capable of expanding to, as they say, to transcend and include lower levels of consciousness within it. And I think the chief person to refer to is a guy called Jean Gebser from the turn of the 20th century, who was the one who came up with sort of levels of consciousness that begin in the archaic and rise to the level of the integral. So integral, you're integrating these lower levels of consciousness. Does that make sense so far?
In broad strokes, yeah.
Yeah. Gebser, who I think was Swiss, was making the argument that we were at a tipping point in history at the turn of the 20th century, that as a whole, there was an opening to a new form of consciousness, which was this integral awareness, probably the blancmange of technology and breakthroughs and learning and problems, etc. Just a new way of looking at everything backwards. And I think that's been accelerated somewhat because of the internet, where it is possible to take a look at ourselves, take a look at what we're doing and reflect on it. Whereas I think having a sense of your own place in the world, for example, if you're an Enlightenment philosopher, it's a bit harder. So the point about that is that if we evolve through levels of consciousness, what are they? And Ken Wilber is probably the chief guy of the integral theory group. And he's saying you go through levels of consciousness which start at archaic, which I think is the place of the starting point for the traditions that you're interested in. But you evolve to magical, mythical consciousness and so on. Maybe that ties in with the agrarian revolution, that kind of thing. You evolve again to the modern outlook, so the Enlightenment kind of thing, where your consciousness is enhanced by science and those kinds of things. That evolves into the postmodern, and then from there it evolves into the integral, where you're able to look at all those levels of your own consciousness, having gone through them, and you're expanded to a wider level of consciousness. I think that's tied to intelligence myself as well, but I like that theory. And I'm just wondering how you feel about that as regards the renewed interest in psychedelics and shamanistic practices, and how it relates to consciousness evolution.
Yeah, I have two ideas that popped into my head about that, and the first is just to sort of almost underline or to reinforce something that was interesting about that perspective, which is that it is very easy to almost, when you're trying to think about how to understand human history, it's very easy to infer a level of omniscience omniscience that sort of we have simply by virtue of the amount of information we have access to. If I want to look up what was going on in a particular time span of the Paleolithic in, say, Eastern Europe, I can get that information in 30 seconds. It might take me a longer time to understand it, but I can get it, and including detailed analyses of artifacts that if you were to look at it in your hand, you would have no idea what it is, right? So the access to information is just incredible. And it's easy to lament in some ways the disconnection we have with our human past, even with, say, something as recent as medieval Christian communities. It's very hard to actually imagine what the experience was like for those people. But at the same time, those people often rarely left their home villages, and their information about the outside world and even the history of their own religion was dreadfully limited in spite of that direct experience. And if you go into the Paleolithic, you can see caves where there was cave art, where people were touching. There's actually handprints in some cases of people touching, making ritual contact with depictions of animals that had already gone extinct. Mm-hmm. And they would have no way of knowing what they were outside of whatever local tradition was preserved in their very small community. There would have been no way of knowing. There was no biology, there was no science, there was no internet. So in a way, I just want to highlight the essential truth of the fact that even though we are sort of disconnected in so many ways with our modern lifestyles from the human past, in other ways, we are connected in ways that no other population of human beings on Earth has ever experienced. And it is a gift. And it's part of the reason I love reading this stuff is that when you want to feel like you are making the most of the gifts of the age that you live in, like that's one of them. We can take it for granted, like looking stuff up on the internet, but in a way it's very powerful, and it's something that has never happened before. So I just wanted to sort of highlight that. I find it a very interesting place. And I think, integral theory is certainly on to something in terms of recognizing the uniqueness of that capability. But the second thing is that when it comes to psychedelics, shamanism, some of the, even mindfulness, I would say, we take it for granted now. In a way, it's been around for a few decades, but it's fairly easy to, join a meetup group on the internet and find a class on mindfulness. That was not possible 50 years ago. You have the dissemination of what John would call psychotechnologies that have become accessible in a way that was never possible before, but they're also understood on a level that was never understood before. The first actual fMRI study of trance states, unless to the best of my knowledge, was 2015. That was 6 years ago. So prior to then, it was a ritual. It was just a ritual that had significance, right? There was no, and of course, there is a problem with reductionism and having to quantify everything to find meaning in it, which is part of, we can say that might be part of the meaning crisis. But at the same time, there is legitimate and valuable information in actually understanding what is happening when these people, what is happening to their bodies when they're having these experiences. And we didn't get this information until 6 years ago. And that's astounding to me. So when it comes to the ability to connect these different practices together in legitimately unique new ways, I think that is possible now and is becoming possible in a way that simply wasn't possible before.
Well said. When I was thinking about this talk, I was trying to bone up on shamanistic practices. There's a guy, I don't know his name, Jerry Sands or someone like that on YouTube. I'm not getting his name right, sorry, but he seemed pretty good. But something that he was describing about shamanistic practices, and you can tell me if it's a universal thing or not, but they were talking about the three levels: the lower world, the middle world, and the upper world. Is that correct? Am I making sense?
Yep. Yeah.
And in particular, what struck me, because again, I'm trying to connect this to my Christian experience. So, I went to, the kind of connection that I was looking for, I found in sort of unapologetically what's called Pentecostal churches. So this was like house churches, and it's like, we're just going to be open to whatever happens, and it was good, strictly speaking, it was a spirituality guided by, a biblical frame and a specific spirit, being the Holy Spirit, etc. But there was an openness to the stranger forms of how that would manifest, rather than, singing hymns, for example. But what I wanted to connect it to, Capello, was this guy was telling the story about, I think it was the lower world. I'm not sure if you call it the lower world or the lower level, but the practice was that the shaman would find a hole in the earth. So it's intrinsically connected to nature, this whole thing, from what I can tell. And it could be like a hole between a tree into the ground, or maybe, I don't know, maybe even a rock. You can tell me, I'm not sure. But this notion of, in order to get that insight, in order to get that connection, in order to, as John Vervaeke says, to break the frame, to get that connectedness to, I'm guessing, the transcendent spirit. I think that's the aim. Okay. This person, they go, and this description was they go into a tree and they'd be inside the tree for, I don't know, a duration. And I kind of started to imagine, Capello, like, what would that be like? And it put me, and I'm hoping we can get into that frame a bit in our conversation, to be perfectly honest, because I don't want to be overly propositional and academic. The interesting thing about all of this is how it drags us into that yearning for the participatory stuff. In any case, it put me in a frame of when I was, seeking, I was genuinely seeking what I call God, and saying, look, I'm just open to be led. Show me what I need to do to connect to you, and just how you're into this frame where you're saying, I'm moving through the world and I'm letting it appear to me. I'm letting things become auspicious or not. Something jumps out at you and it has this kind of meaning as regards your journey towards connecting to that greater sense. What do you think about that?
Yeah, so that story and sort of cosmology is definitely pretty universal, where there is typically a three worlds kind of view, where we have our world, and then you have a lower world. Sometimes it's called the underworld, and then there's an upper sort of divine realm. And sometimes they're a little ambiguous. In Celtic mythology, I think it's just it's called the other world, and I think it has characteristics of both. But definitely the story of having to go through a passage or a hole or some sort of cleft in the earth is something that you find in multiple different cultures, and seems to be connected to what is often called an initiation practice in traditional shamanic societies, or societies that practice shamanism, where to create a new shaman, essentially there is a event that seems to have almost universal patterns of death. I would say psychological death. In some cases, it's associated, if it doesn't work, it can be associated with actual physical death, which could be the result of many different things. It could just be the result of the care and danger that's associated with the initiation phase, where it's normally described as a journey to the underworld, um, a, a death of the death of yourself, and the reconstitution of yourself, a rebirth. And that is when you become a new shaman. And you can see this, you can see echoes of this even in European myth. The story of Dionysus is, closely parallels this, where there's a journey, there's a death often in a cave, usually in some underground space, and then there's a rebirth. And this happens, I think it's impossible to know, it is speculative, but it is hard to believe that the death and rebirth stories associated with the underworld that you find in Near Eastern and ancient European myth, even though we don't have a direct connection to shamanistic practices in those cultures, it is difficult to imagine that they're not connected in some way. And this is a pattern that you can see even in Australia. And as my understanding is that the Australian Indigenous people have a similar story as well, which is important in the sense that they have essentially been, their traditions have not been syncretized with the rest of, in Eurasia, for example, you had the Evenki and the Nenets and the Sami and all these different people sort of communicating and trading beliefs, and it's hard to say where things came from. But in Australia, those folks made it out there and then no one else came for thousands of years. So the story of death and rebirth seems to be fairly universal. And it is, based on my own practices and my own experiences, I would say it's the danger and care that goes into that is warranted, and there's a reason it's narrated. It has a certain structure, and there are reasons it's narrated that way. You essentially lose yourself for a while, and it can be without support. It can be, I think, a terrifying and disorienting experience, even with somebody who's fairly stable and open-minded. And that might be a good, as an aside, when these topics come up, and especially, and I respect this a lot, I started doing this stuff myself before I found John Vervaeke. And John Vervaeke says in several places in the Meaning Crisis series and in several other places as well, that these sorts of practices should probably not be explored too much outside of an existing wisdom tradition and outside of guidance and support. And I just want to sort of echo that concern. It is, things will happen to you, whether you expect them, want them to, or not. And they're powerful experiences, and they should not be trifled with. One of the things that interests me in the sort of Vervaeke Discord, the community that's building, especially even projects like The Religion That's Not a Religion, is the ability to create a structure for guidance and support for people who don't have access to traditional sources of wisdom and information, to be able to navigate and experiment with these things safely. And I don't think we're there yet. We simply don't have the expertise or the people. But I think it is an important goal towards being able to bridge some of these gaps and actually make use of some of these psychotechnologies safely. But to sort of wheel it back around to your original question, these are very powerful experiences. And the interesting thing about them is that, I was asking myself as I was getting into this, will these things do anything for somebody who does not believe necessarily in any of the things that the practices themselves point to? What happens when a person who doesn't necessarily have any religious faith or any experience in religion, what happens when a person like that tries to talk to God or tries to commune with, their human ancestors in some sort of deeper spiritual level? Does it, can it, what happens? And the answer is when you use these practices, things will happen, whether you expect them to or intend for them to or not. And in that sense, it's very powerful. And I think that's why they are universal in the different cultures that they appear in. In a certain sense, I, as a Westerner who's disconnected from any actual shamanic practice, the fact that structurally the same sorts of experiences will unfold, even in a very altered form based on the modern mind. The fact that they unfold at all, I think, speaks to the universal nature of our capacity for these types of insights and experiences, which is something I thought could happen, but it was very surprising and eye-opening when it did.
Yeah, again, you've put out a smorgasbord there. I take note of what you said about them being powerful. I take note as well right. I mean, the going into the earth thing, and that it struck me as you're saying that's rather womb-like, for one thing, and connecting to initiation. Also, the need for constraint. As you rightly point out, John, saying that it needs to be set within a structure. A careful one. And that brought to my mind something that I had learned, which is that another one of those dynamics that has evolved with the shamans is that it nearly always appears to be the existing shaman finds an apprentice somehow and apprentices that person into that tradition. And perhaps that might be the model in terms of what you're saying. There needs to be structured guidance. The apprentice needs to be molded, as it were, to avoid the pitfalls. But the other interesting thing that brings to mind, Capello, is that tying those two things together, if the shamanic rituals have an element of I'm not sure how to describe this now. We're getting into a subtle area, and I expected this would be a subtle conversation. If the shamanic experience is intrinsically and essentially tied up with a person awakening a mode of consciousness that is open to possibility, that's outside of regular constraint. I think that guy Terence McKenna talks about shamans breaking cultural constraints out of necessity, and so on and so on. That, I think you alluded to it earlier by talking about danger, in the sense that if you're really going to give it a go, if you're really going to step into a dimension which is unknown to you, which has a formative effect on you, it is inherently dangerous. Could you talk to that? Oh, and if I may, sorry to jump in, but inherently dangerous, but also pregnant with potential, power. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think part of the danger, and actually this sort of ties into the initiation process too. In a lot of societies that have include shamanistic practices, the process of selection for an apprentice or somebody to be initiated will often be somebody who might have what we would call, mental health issues, um, pathological mental health issues. And, or they will be somebody who had either some sort of childhood trauma, either a psychological trauma or um, a severe illness of some kind. Um, and there could be a lot of different reasons for this, but I think one of the more compelling possibilities is that, particularly when it comes to childhood trauma, there is a structural link in some ways, in terms of the neuroscience, there's a relationship between what we would call dissociative states, um, mirror in some ways the brain states that you find in people who have undergone shamanic trance. So there's a possibility that um, that this selection process might have to do with the fact that some people are more able to make use of these practices than others. They'll be more effective with some people than others.
Yeah.
Which, if you don't know that going in, how susceptible you are to them, then you're really rolling the dice in a sense with your own sort of psychological integrity, um, which could be a risk that some people might not realize in themselves. And so that is something to be very cautious of, and I think something to take very seriously. But on the other hand, the reason that is even a risk is that it can be very powerful in terms of generating insights into forming understandings that you might not have, putting together things that you might not see as being related. Because essentially you're talking about a brain state where parts of your brain that normally don't talk to each other are communicating in a way that you no longer have full control over, which can be terrifying. When I started experimenting with these things myself, I had a whole program of things that I wanted to try in terms of structure, and I was going to do this, and then I was going to try doing this. And it did not take long before that went completely out the window in terms of this thing when you start following sort of the recipe of how these states are entered, they have a internal structure that will unfold whether you intend it to or not. And you have some control, but not nearly as much as I would have guessed.
Yeah, that brings to mind, I mean, again, so many things, but immediately the necessity of being receptive.
Yeah, that's actually, I mean, that's a kind of a good segue into another part of this, which is something I haven't totally figured out how to navigate myself, which is if you're coming at this from a secular background, which I am, I'm not a materialist in the traditional sense. My sort of philosophical background is more in existential phenomenology, which is in some ways is an advantage because in phenomenology, you take the human experience and you realize that is first, and that is the building blocks of all other knowledge, including science. And it puts you in a position, I think, to be fairly honest with yourself about your experiences and your meaning. You don't need to second guess your experiences. You might need to second guess what they mean for the rest of the world, for the rest of your life. You might need to second guess where they fit into things, but you don't need to second guess what you're experiencing. And you don't need to necessarily say to yourself when you're experiencing something that's unusual, well, this is objectively real outside of me, right? You don't need that kind of validation from outside of you. You can just say, this happened to me. And whatever more meaning it has for your life, that will unfold on its own in a way. But there's definitely a process where you're accessing, the things are happening in your mind, in your emotions, in your memory that are not familiar to you and that are significant. But there's also a huge amount of noise in the sense of these are mental states that will reliably produce profound insights. They will also reliably produce a profound amount of bullshit and self-deception. And that's sort of why these wisdom communities are so important, I think, for contextualizing it. It's not just about the danger to the psychological health of the individual, but I mean, I don't know how familiar you are with Aleister Crowley, um, and I forget what his religion was called. I don't know that much about him, but if you look at what he did, he essentially, you know, went into an altered state of consciousness for a prolonged period of time and came out with it with a new religion, right? And if you don't have good boundaries and a good wisdom community around you, and this is, I don't mean any offense to anyone who finds inspiration in his work, but that is what happened to him. He spoke to, you know, he had a transcendent experience and he spoke to something outside of himself that gave him a new religion. If you don't have good boundaries and good ways of sort of error checking your own experiences, a way of contextualizing it with other people, that can happen very easily. And that might not be what you're looking for in practicing these things, right?
I like how you brought up Aleister Crowley. There's a guy, Gary Lachman, who I believe used to be the bass player for Blondie, the 70s group, who has really gone to town on all of these esoteric traditions. Do you know Gary?
I don't, but I love Blondie.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah, apparently he was the bass player. So he's very informative. I'll link you later, especially about these kinds of things. I mean, what this brings up is the point that John Vervaeke makes really well, which is, and you know, I might actually borrow something from the New Testament to help me explain this, where St. Paul says, you know, if I speak in the tongues of men and angels, but I don't have love, it's worthless. If I give all that I have to the poor, but I don't have love, it's worthless, etc., etc. It's a really good passage about the importance of comparing the awe of transcendent experience and the power of that with the counterbalance of character. And this is John's point explicitly. He's saying, if you're going for these practices, but it doesn't turn you into it doesn't improve your character, you're missing the mark. And Aleister Crowley is an excellent example of that. I can kind of understand why Aleister Crowley emerged in his culture, because again, I learned this from Lachman, his background was, you know, super strict Christian upbringing, perhaps a little bit like John Vervaeke, I don't know. But his family was well-to-do. I think they owned a brewery. You probably know that. I think it was a brewery. And so you have a person who rightly, as far as I can tell, is kicking the goads of the cultural Christianity. And maybe his father was sincere, I don't know. But perhaps a guy like Crowley noticed a disconnect between certain cultural forms and the beauty and the power and the awe of the kind of unconstrained and transcendent and deeply attractive, what's called a cult dimension. But a terrible person by all accounts.
Yeah, and there's a great, so this sort of segues into, you know, maybe talking about what are the potential connections between Christianity and shamanistic techniques. And I think a good potential example of this is there's a woman who does this with Buddhism. Her name is Isa Guichardi. She has some stuff on YouTube, but she has a great lecture on the differences between Buddhism and shamanism, and how, you know, one of the things that Buddhism brings to the table in terms of exploring these techniques is moral guidance and a emphasis on personal integrity and a sense of discipline that is not always there in traditional shamanic practices, and it's certainly not there necessarily in autodidactic attempts to revive some of these practices. So I think her way of making use of some of the psychotechnologies within her own tradition, working backwards from her own tradition, bringing some of these things in safely to sort of develop them and to enhance something that is already sort of on the path of what she's trying to accomplish within a religion that has clear guidelines and a clear set of moral purpose. We already see some of that a little bit in some charismatic Christian communities. Tanya Lorman, who I mentioned before, writes about this a little bit. These are movements that came out of the 1960s predominantly that are involved in ecstatic prayer, charismatic ecstatic prayer. Sounds like you've seen a little bit of them yourself, because the Pentecostals will sometimes.
That was my connection to mysticism, was through that tradition. Yeah, it started in 1900s. This thing called the Azusa Street Revival. But please continue. Yeah.
So I would wonder, and I asked sort of a question sort of along these lines to John at not the last Q&A, but the one before. What is the connection between charismatic, intense prayer, where you actually have an experience of not necessarily having an auditory hallucination of God, but you have a feeling of, it could be classified as inspired thought, or thought that doesn't seem to be authored by yourself, that comes from a higher moral place, a place of wisdom that you don't feel that you necessarily possess yourself. And this is something that has been developed in a number of Christian communities for a while now. And this is the subject of a lot of Tanya Lorman's work, but also bears a very close resemblance to, I think, what John is getting at, with internalizing the sage and practices related to being able to cultivate wisdom as a way of being able to infer or hear the voice of embodied goodness in a way, or being able to embody values in a perspectival and participatory way that is somewhat not the norm in our highly propositional culture. And I think that ability and being able to enhance that ability could profit by looking at some of the older shamanistic techniques, where the trance state is originally aimed, usually not at any sort of particularly intense esoteric state, but is mostly aimed at embodying aspects of nature and the environment, where you try to get into the mind of either game animals that you might be pursuing, or you might be trying to get into the mind of people who are ill in your community, or people who need help in your community. A very common practice in shamanic traditions is something that's in the academic literature called soul retrieval, where you go to the underworld to retrieve somebody's soul. Now, what are we really talking about? I think you're talking about the shaman embodying what that person was or what they hoped to be before they had some sort of traumatic experience, and bringing a sense of themselves back that they have lost. That's a powerful ability. And I think if, there might be a possibility of channeling some of these things safely within the context of existing wisdom communities, and maybe even pursuing them independently with sufficient support, research, and expertise outside of them. Again, I'm looking to something like The Religion Without a Religion, with enough growth and development, maybe that type of framework could support it as well.
Yes. I suppose, for reference, the best person that I've come across from a Christian perspective trying to absorb what shamanism has to offer is a Dominican called Matthew Fox. Have you heard of Matthew Fox?
I have not.
Yeah, well worth your time, I would think, Capello. Matthew Fox wrote a book maybe 8 years ago or something. I can't remember the title. It's Creative something. And I haven't read it. But his point was that genuine mystical experience of the type that Hildegard of Bingen had, Julian of Norwich, Thomas Aquinas he holds up as a great mystic, which I find powerful, given that Aquinas is so heavily allied to the propositional way of knowing, and others, I suppose, Meister Eckhart, etc. And Matthew Fox is making the argument that Christianity needs to embody the connectedness to nature that shamanistic practices bring, the celebration and the joy of connecting to nature. I think that's his basic argument. Dancing, trance, like trance music even, he includes in that, but he's making the explicit argument, which I don't have a problem with. But what it does introduce, Capello, is the resistance within Christian culture to shamanistic practices. Are you with me so far?
Absolutely.
So the sticky part, and I think we may have to wrap up shortly in about 10 minutes. I've just got to exit at 1:15. But the sticky point is, and this goes into that whole liminal space that's both attractive, dangerous, full of pregnant with opportunity, holding the promise of what it is you're aspiring towards, etc. Is, how do you navigate that? And this, to me, there was a chap on the Discord server who actually made a connection that I hadn't made before from Heidegger, which this person, I think you were dialoguing with them, I don't know their name, I'm sorry, but he was putting forward the idea that Heidegger's resuscitation of the Greek term for truth being aletheia, he was saying, well, that's just revelation. And I never made that connection before. Heidegger is so neo-dualistic and all of this stuff that it's hard to know exactly where to put your finger on the guy. But I thought, okay, well, that is a great way to look at the connection between something propositional, such as what becomes true for you, and the spiritual experience of things opening up and becoming revealed to you. But so for a Christian going through, let's say, the initiation, what are the mentor-apprentice dynamics there? Well, what you have is the Bible and people who outline what's in the Bible. And to me, by the way, when I was starting out, that was a path littered with problems. I sort of thought to myself, I don't exactly get the idea that someone from my community who studied the Bible for a while has a way to interpret it that I should just swallow. That's never sat well with me. Having said that, you've got this whole canon. And something I wanted to introduce into our discussion was a notion which occurred to me, but it's never popped up before, called textuality, and how that might have changed shamanism and how integral it might be to Christianity, in the sense that, shamanistic practices must be, from oral, tribal media, cave paintings, dancing, whatever symbol, rituals you have. Maybe there's something to do with blood. I have no idea. But, Christianity, as it's unfolded over the centuries, has this kind of central text focus, which even within the Bible, it warns you about. Not to live by the letter of the law, but you should live by the spirit of the law, and this kind of tension. So the point I'm making there is, one, about textuality. How does that interfere or enhance the goal of the shaman and or the Christian? And I'm getting a little bit off my base there, but how does that sit with you there?
Yeah, so let me riff on that, and I'll do it quickly to be sensitive to our time commitment. So the first thing I'll get to real quick is the textuality thing. I think it is important in the sense that what you do see in the mystical traditions that happen after, I would say, the Roman Empire, late antiquity onward, is that you see the intrusion or the development, however you want to look at it, of textuality in mystical practices, Kabbalah, numerology, things like that start coming up organically. And I think it is because, it's a salient dimension that wasn't there before. That being said, shamanic states, when you actually enter a trance state, favor a state of right brain dominance that, at least in my limited experience with these things, does not seem to be very symbolically, in terms of literal written language, does not seem to be very present at all. Sometimes even verbal language is not present at all. Sometimes it's a struggle even to make any kind of connection verbally with what you're experiencing. So basically the state itself will kind of take over and kind of wash that history away a little bit. On the other hand, where it really comes into play, I think, is making sense of the experiences. If you have a symbolic framework, a narrative system, a system of symbols to make sense of these very chaotic, altered states of consciousness that's coming out of them, to try to find meaning and bridge different concepts together. In that sense, literacy and symbolism, I think, is vitally important and can be, and already has been used in Western mystical traditions, for at least the past 500 years. The other thing I want to speak to is this question of how would Christian communities navigate these very tricky experiences? And I think the answer, to some extent, again, to turn to Tanya Luhrmann's work, is that they already are, in the sense that you have people practicing ecstatic prayer that they need a community of trust, usually a small group of people that they trust very deeply, very close friends within the church, where they can share what they hear from God, what they're experiencing with God, in a very open, trusting way, but where somebody else can gently, using symbolism in the Bible, using their own experiences, integrate these sometimes anomalous thoughts or impressions that people are having in a way that fit together with the community's vision, its ethics, and its sort of internal narrative structure. And it's a tricky thing. These are very personal experiences for these people, but Dr. Luhrmann does a really good job, I think, of showing how do you make sense of these, strange aspects of the human mind that are nevertheless deeply meaningful and emotionally powerful to people, and how do you tie it into a story that puts you back into the community? And I think when it comes to ecstatic prayer, at least, I think the Christians are already doing that in some denominations. So it can be done. How far can it go? Unknown. But I think the capacity is certainly there.
It's beautifully put, Capello. I mean, that's been my experience. So, you know, through seeking and taking, you know, many knocks, especially at the early stage, you know, I formed my own relationship to God through praying, you know, and things like speaking in tongues to me was incredibly transformative, to be perfectly honest. You know, I was raised in a very propositional world. So the frame breaking experience of speaking in tongues was a breakthrough, and I still do it. And I find that it opens me up instantly to insight. What, you know, I think what Christians would call hearing from God, you know, clearly. So you're right about that. That it is happening, and it's an interesting time for people who are part of the charismatic movement. So you do see the kinds of extraordinary demonstrations of this in the charismatic churches where, you know, people will go up and they say, you know, I know there's someone here in the meeting who's called this and they've got a 12-year-old daughter who's got this problem and blah, blah, blah. And it's spot on. And it happens regularly and reliably, as John Vervaeke would say. There's some element to that. In the Christian world, based out of the book of Corinthians, that's called the word of knowledge, the word of knowledge. And I'm interested in that. I find it extraordinary, enticing, and interesting, that kind of level of insight that can only come through something outside of yourself. So I agree with you. Because we have to kind of close shortly, Capella, I just wanted to finish with a bit of a story, and I hope we can continue this another time because I feel like we're just sort of starting to get the surface. I hope that's okay with you. I did have a listen to Paul van der Klay's Discord discussion. He had like 3 people from the charismatic movement who were kind of moving beyond it in their own ways. They were all fairly young, maybe 30 years or younger. I could be wrong about that. There was a lady, 2 guys. And they'd all come from the charismatic, and strictly speaking, I think you must be North American. I don't know which part, but one of them was from the USA, and she'd been raised in a Pentecostal church. So that cultural frame was all over it, as, you know, mixed in with the genuine kind of experiences and problems and human muck, you know. One of them was a guy who had fallen in love. And by the way, she had decided, I think under the influence of Pajot, to become Orthodox. And, you know, couldn't sing the praises of Orthodoxy enough. And I noticed Paul van der Klay made a really insightful remark, which he said, you know, when I was growing up, people couldn't, you know, were falling over themselves to escape Orthodoxy or traditional church, which was an interesting observation about how things are shifting in this space. Another one also was really influenced by Orthodox theology. And a third one had just sort of come out of training in one of the kind of dynamic sort of charismatic churches in California, and had sort of seen both the wonderful nature of those kinds of things, but on the other hand, the very human side. And it was interesting to see, and even myself, you know, I don't go to church. I feel like I've got my connection. If I talk to another Christian, I feel like I'm doing church. But there's an element of all of that sort of moving and reforming, as it were.
I'll leave you with just a little metaphor, I guess, to sort of just tie that up a little bit. You know, in ancient times, baking bread was considered a somewhat mysterious and magical process where you started with a flour and water, and then, you know, before they actually understood and used special strains of yeast, it would grow. It would, under the right conditions, it would grow. And I sort of I sort of think with all these different sort of religious traditions that we have and different forms of even just spirituality that have cropped up, I kind of feel like the sort of psychotechnologies that are embedded in the oldest spiritual traditions our species have, shamanism, is almost like the yeast. And wherever that yeast finds itself, it will express itself in a different way, but something will grow, whether it's in Christianity or whether it's among secular people who are interested in cognitive science. If you allow the practices to emerge in a safe and reasonable and wise way, growth will happen.
That's a great metaphor or analogy with yeast and growth. Well, I have to get going. So this has been very stimulating. Thanks, Capello.
It's been a absolute pleasure, and thank you for talking to me. I deeply appreciate it.
Well, likewise. Did you want to do another one, or are you okay to just leave it there?
Let's continue the exploration if you're game.
I am so game. I'm really keen to learn from you, and have done much so already. So I'll stop the recording, and I'll say goodbye.